welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Leadenhall Market today in the City of London. I have briefly covered this at the start of a broader video on the City of London pubs. It's a bit old now and I don't really think I've done it justice. I think I perhaps cast the net a bit too wide. So today I'm going to see if we can find an interesting selection of historic pubs purely in and on the edges of Leadenhall Market. Pub number one, the Lamb. Surprisingly busy here for just gone midday. Cheers from the Lamb. The Lamb sits at the main crossing inside Leadenhall Market. It's one corner of this sort of octagonal shaped crossing. Leadenhall Market is of course the work of Sir Horace Jones, who is more famous for Tower Bridge and was also the architect behind Smithfield Market and Billingsgate Market. It was constructed in 1880 to 1881, but replaced a market on this site that had been here probably going back to at least the 15th, possibly 14th century. It may, according to some sources, have been started by Richard Whittington, yes, the one with the cat, and the northern entrance into Leadenhall Market is now named after him. Not the cat, Richard Whittington. Looking at the other three shops in those four corner positions, they all have a corner entrance, and the Lamb is unusual in not having one. Today it's just a large window with a sort of red cabinet that looks a bit like a sort of street side electricity cabinets or cable wiring cabinets, whatever they are. That corner, presumably a former entrance to the Lamb Tavern, is flanked on either side by what I believe are actually ironwork columns. They have initially Ionic, I believe, capitals, and they're decorated with human faces and also swags. Above those capitals are the silver dragons denoting the City of London. So you absolutely can't forget whose turf you're on. Along one side of the Lamb Tavern are today three entrances. Two of them, I believe, marked private bar, one marked public bar. The windows along one side have etching in them. I just initially dismissed them as being relatively modern, but that one in the corner has the inscription W. Pardy, Wine and Spirit Merchant. Now, having said earlier that I believe that corner was originally an entrance like the other three units on the crossroads here at Leadenhall, I'm now actually not so sure, because that name goes back to a series of owners in the 19th century of this pub, and we'll come back to them later. This is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. It just has a 1-star rating, so not a lot of the original fabric is preserved. One of the most notable features, as you enter on the right-hand door, there is a large tiled panel from Simpson and Sons. We've seen those in other pubs elsewhere in London, and that dates to the 1880s. It apparently pertains to Sir Christopher Wren. A lot of the other fixtures and fittings that we see inside the bar today now are more modern. There is this sort of mezzanine layer. I believe that was added at some point in relatively recent history in the last few decades. There is a spiral staircase leading up to that. And there's a series of nice, rather prominent lanterns hanging down. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the Lamb Tavern. Various sources, including What Pub, and indeed it's even etched into the windows, suggest that the pub dates from 1780. However, I found at least one mention of a lamb in Leadenhall Market from 1753. It's an interesting account about a man who had a wen, that's a slightly archaic term for a cyst or a tumour, on his neck, I believe, that was about the size of a child's head. And that was cured seemingly almost miraculously by a surgeon, Mr. Ogle of Walbrook. As an aside, the agrarian pamphleteer and later Member of Parliament, briefly, William Cobbett, referred to London as the Great Wen, the Great Boil or the Great Cyst. And here's a later newspaper mention from 1777, which appears to continue that theme of slightly dubious medical cures. In this case, even more dubious sounding, the Fruiterer unique, the unique powder is that? I believe this is a lady who had suffered a stroke and was miraculously cured by this particular powder. A newspaper mention of 1818 is the earliest I could find, with a member of the Pardy family associated with this pub, and I believe they ran the pub for almost all of the 19th century. It seems that they were members of the Worshipful Company of Innholders, and through that were able to become freemen of the City of London. The Company of Innholders is one of London's 100 or so livery companies, still exists today, more of a sort of charitable organisation in its current form. You can think of the livery companies as effectively like guilds. They champion the cause of a particular trade. Here's the lamb shown on an 1870s Ordnance Survey map, just prior to that 1880s rebuild of Leadenhall. Compare that, for example, to Goad's map a decade or so later, just after that rebuild of Leadenhall Market. I think you can get a glimpse of a bit of the Lamb Tavern in this 1891 painting by William Luca. It's mostly of the market and gives you a sense of the atmosphere of the market at that time. It's a Young's pub today. I went for a half, which I've just about finished now, of London Original. Pub number 2, Old Tom's Bar. Cheers from the Old Tom. This is in fact the basement of the Lamb, and I'm not really sure that it counts as a pub in its own right. Both are owned by Young's today. There's still the usual familiar Young's lineup of beers on the bar, but they actually also have quite a, I think, impressive whiskey offering, and they do sort of cheese and charcuterie boards or something like that. And I think it's only existed in this incarnation since something like 2011. However, I've included this partly because actually some of the interior features here are better preserved than the upstairs. There's this beautiful green and cream coloured tiling on the wall that actually reminds me a bit of a pie and mash shop, and that apparently is an original feature from the late Victorian period. It also has this rather attractive curved staircase leading down to it, and that has some nice stained and leaded glass part of the partition there, with a lovely old sign saying "to the wine bar and smoking room." So in a way there is a little bit more charm to the interior here than there is upstairs in the Lamb. The other reason for including it is that it's a fun story about a one-time character of Leadenhall Market called Old Tom, after whom the bar here is named. He happens to also be a goose. Old Tom is believed to have been born in Ostend in Belgium in 1797 and lived to the ripe old age of 37 or 38. Such a character was he that an obituary was written about him in the Times. He was originally a decoy goose, somehow ended up here in Leadenhall, but was recognised for the celebrity that he is. One of my favourite bits from this obituary about Old Tom is that apparently he was a frequent visitor at the nearby gin palaces. This has some lovely detail in it. Cream of the Valley, not a phrase I'd heard before, is an old-fashioned euphemism for gin. He could occasionally be found drunk and disorderly, and apparently at a certain time of day he could be seen waddling with some dignity into the Rose and Crown, where the hostess there would always have a delicious morsel waiting for him. As I mentioned earlier, has quite an impressive whiskey lineup, so rather unusually I've actually gone for a glass of Livery, which I think came in at a pretty reasonable price. I'll put the price on the screen. It's served in a very, I think, appropriate shaped glass. These tulip glasses help to sort of funnel the aromas of the malt into your nose so you can appreciate them better than you would be able to with a straight-sided glass. A bit early in the day for it, but it's very nice. Pub number 3, the Bunch of Grapes. Cheers from the Bunch of Grapes. Choosing a lunchtime on a weekday to try and film at City of London pubs was a very bad idea. This is right on the edge of Leadenhall Market. It's possibly just outside it, but it has one frontage onto Lime Street, the other onto Beehive Passage, which is one of the entrances into Leadenhall Market. It has a facade that is entirely made of Peterhead granite. We have Ruth Siddall, our favourite pub geologist, to thank for that identification. Peterhead, as a reminder, is a town in northeast Scotland, not far from Aberdeen. And I think it does firmly date at least this ground floor exterior part to that late Victorian, possibly early Edwardian period. There are also wood-framed windows with small panes. Some of them have crown glass in them, which I always want to call bottle glass, but I think crown glass is the correct name for it, that sort of slightly circular shaped glass. On the upper floors, I don't know if these are called joms or reveals, the gaps in between the windows have a kind of sunflower motif. Again, that's possibly an indicator of that sort of late Victorian, early Edwardian period. Between the first and second floors, you can see the coat of arms of the Company of Vintners. So this is another one of those City of London livery companies. A chevron with 3 barrels. I think they're officially called tons in the heraldic language, normally in silver, but here of course they're just in grey Portland stone. This attests to the fact that this pub was actually at one time owned by the Vintners Company, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. The upper floors on the side facing Beehive Passage are a bit more plain, just London stock brick. This doesn't feature on camera's list of historic pub interiors, but I think there are possibly some original late Victorian, possibly early Edwardian features still remaining. Most notable is this plaster frieze with bunches of grapes fitting for the name of the pub around most of the area behind the bar. There's also a high plasterboard ceiling and 4 big Hundy lamps. The mosaic by the door, the entrance from Beehive Passage, also caught my eye. The earliest record I could find for the pub, thanks to the London Wiki or Pubs History website, was 1805, at which time the pub wasn't exactly named, but there was a wine and brandy merchant named William Boulnois at this address, 14 Lime Street. The earliest record I could find of the grapes specifically mentioned by name is in an electoral register of 1835. The lease was up for sale in 1848, and there's a note that it was held directly from the Vintners Company, and also that it was an old established and excellent house, which suggests it may go further back than that earliest record I could find of 1802. Here it is on the 1870s Ordnance Survey map, and I believe further along Beehive Passage is the pub which gave its name to the alley, also marked with a PH there. By the time of this 1890s Ordnance Survey map, the beehive is no more, but it does look like the bunch of grapes has been extended a bit and still survives. It's a Nicholson's pub today. Here is the lineup on the bar. I of course went for a half of Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 4, the Swan Tavern. Cheers from the Swan. Another pub where it is very difficult to find a quiet spot to film, sort of right on the edge here. This is why this backdrop is a little bit uninteresting, sorry about that. It's an interesting building that sort of straddles Ship Tavern Passage. The facing that is more over towards, I think it's Gracechurch Street, isn't it, is, I would say, roughly Queen Anne Revival. It's red brick with some white banding, and it has a delicate brick panel. I think that is one of the motifs, even if it doesn't have sunflowers in it, with a swan logo up in the, I think that's called the tympanum of the pediment right up at the top, that gable at the top. And then lower down you can also see the date that presumably the building was built, 1898. The ground floor frontage has some polished granite, which is very satisfying. This hasn't been identified by Ruth Siddall. My guess is this is also some kind of Aberdeenshire sort of Peterhead style granite. Inside it has 2 bars, a ground floor and a first floor bar, and the first floor bar partly goes into that section of the building that straddles Ship Tavern Passage. There is a flagstone floor downstairs and a marble countertop to the bar. I don't know if I've managed to capture that particularly well. There are some old mirrors in there, including one Fuller's, Smith and Turner's mirror, and another, I forget the exact logo on it, but here it is. A couple of coats of arms. I hoped to keep with the theme they might be of the livery companies, but I think they actually probably relate to former monarchs. The earliest record that I could find, which was also the earliest record on the London Wiki or Pubs History site, is from 1861, a transfer of licences. That suggests to me if the licence was being transferred, that the pub already existed in some form prior to that. Richard Haynes, from whom the licence was being transferred, possibly had already been resident here on Ship Tavern Passage and may have even converted his former business or possibly even home into a pub. There are records of a barber even by the name of Richard Haynes on Ship Tavern Passage, and then a fruiterer in 1845. This 1839 directory listing helpfully shows a list of the residences and businesses on Ship Tavern Passage at that time, and it seems then at least there was only one pub, the Rose and Crown, and we referred to that earlier. That was a favourite haunt of old Tom the Goose. So I suspect the pub came into existence sometime between 1839 and 1861. J.T. Wilson made this painting in 1870, which shows the Swan Tavern in quite a lot of detail. That was prior to the current version of the building that we see today, that, as a reminder, was from 1898. Here's Ship Tavern Passage on the 1870s Ordnance Survey map. There are two pubs marked with a PH on the map at that time, both the Swan and also the Rose and Crown. There's a fantastic article in the Strand magazine from 1892 of presumably a grown-up harking back to his childhood, where he used to come to Ship Tavern Passage to buy various weird and wonderful animals. And it seems even after the rebuild of most of Leadenhall Market in 1881, Ship Tavern Passage hung on as a sort of echo of an earlier version of Leadenhall Market, where it was all a bit more wild and wonderful. As he writes, "Dear old Ship Tavern Passage, cumbered with cages, boxes and baskets, littered with straw, sand and sawdust, filled with barks, yelps, crows and clucks, and the smell of mice and rabbits." Joseph Pennell, the American illustrator, made this sketch looking down through the arch from Gracechurch Street. Although some sources date this to 1903, I think looking at the glimpse you get there of the Swan Tavern, you can see the pilasters either side of that main window on the first floor, which I think correspond to the earlier version of the building rather than the way we see it today in this post-1898 rebuild. It's a fuller's pub today. I went for a half of Seafarers. Here's a lineup of what else they had on offer on the bar. Pub number 5, the New Moon. Cheers from the New Moon, which I keep calling the Half Moon. It used to be called the Half Moon. Like the Lamb, this is built into the fabric of Leadenhall Market. But unlike the Lamb, it's not purely contained in the interior. It also occupies part of this magnificent entrance to Leadenhall Market that faces onto Gracechurch Street. I wonder if this entrance gets a little bit overlooked because people are so keen to get inside and enjoy the splendour of the interior of Leadenhall Market. But I think that entrance onto Gracechurch Street is a very impressive bit of architecture in its own right. The pub occupies, as you're facing it from Gracechurch Street, part of the right-hand side of that bit of building work. It has been described as possibly something like Flemish Renaissance, I don't know, Dutch Revival. It's got a couple of curvy gables at the top that are certainly somewhat Dutch and or Flemish in style. It's mostly red brick with Portland stone dressing. It has a couple of tourelles projecting, and atop those are weather vanes with peacocks, I believe they're supposed to depict. That entrance is depicted in this 1881 engraving, and it's quite interesting to compare the way it looks today with the way it looked presumably immediately after that rebuilding of Leadenhall Market. The main difference in terms of the pub here, the New Moon, formerly known as the Half Moon, is that at that time it appears that entire right-hand side was indoor space, whereas now that's converted into something more like a porch. Inside, perhaps the most ornate and, I believe, original feature from that late Victorian rebuild is this ornate ceiling. I found an article from the 1990s that a refurbishment was carried out at that time. Normally refurbishments are bad news for pubs, but in this particular instance, that actually removed a false ceiling and found above that this Victorian ceiling that we now see today. So I think that does date back to that 1880s rebuild. So I think I may have given this pub short shrift in the past. I always instinctively walk past it and go straight to the Lamb whenever I'm in the area coming to Leadenhall for a drink. But actually this may well be the oldest pub in the immediate vicinity of Leadenhall Market. As alluded to previously, it was originally named the Half Moon, and for some period of time gave its name to this thoroughfare as Half Moon Passage. At some point in the mid-20th century, 1940s to 1950s, the pub was renamed for reasons unbeknownst to me from the Half Moon to the New Moon. The earliest mention I could find of it is from 1722 in the Weekly Journal or Saturday's Post. So here's Leadenhall Market at the time of John Rock's map of 1746. We believe the pub would have existed at that time. Half Moon Passage isn't named at that time, but I think it may correspond to that southern passageway you can see that leads to the Hyde Market area of Leadenhall. By the 1870s, just prior to that major rebuild of the market, you can see Half Moon Passage named on the map, and the pub is marked with a PH on the corner with Gracechurch Street. The architect John Sulman made this depiction of Old Leadenhall Market, presumably in the 1870s before it was rebuilt. And I think the top right-hand panel here shows Half Moon Passage, whilst the one immediately beneath that shows Half Moon Corner, according to the legend. Possibly you get a glimpse of the pub in one or the other of those, but it's not entirely clear to me. It's a Greene King pub today. I had a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. Okay, that's going to be it for today from Leadenhall Market. I think it's a really interesting corner within the City of London. Lots of history, lots of impressive, I think, architecture, and a decent handful of pubs hopefully there. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.